All right, so last night we had the first and I think only official Senate debate that's going to happen between the two Senate candidates up in Pennsylvania, Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. And I'm not going to lie to you guys, I'm not going to try to sugarcoat this video. It did not go well, okay? For anybody who is a fan of John Fetterman, obviously he recently went through a stroke and he's somewhat healed from that. He is still obviously recovering from that. And according to what we do know from his doctors and from his medical information that we have gotten, it definitely doesn't seem like this is something that would directly affect his capacity to actually do the job of being a senator. And it's really more of like a difficulty with auditory processing and a difficulty with his speech patterns sometimes. But during this debate, it was very, very apparent that he was struggling to get his points across sometimes. And so we're going to run through some of these clips here, but you guys are going to see what I'm referencing. And, this isn't just my opinion. This is something that even the John Fetterman campaign was warning about ahead of time. So here from Yahoo News, this is just from a couple days ago. They said Fetterman has set expectations pretty low ahead of Pennsylvania Senate debate full panel. So, I mean, listen, again, they were kind of giving us a little bit of a warning on this, that this wasn't going to be the best appearance for him. Now, also you have to consider that John Fetterman was never really a good debater, even before he had this stroke. But I definitely think that this just made it all the more difficult for him. And so we're going to start off here with a clip of him towards the beginning of this debate, where he directly references the stroke and kind of ties it into his overall campaign message. So let's just go ahead and jump into this here.
Let's also talk about the elephant in the room. I had a stroke. He's never let me forget that. And I might miss some words during this debate, mush two words together, but it knocked me down, but I'm going to keep coming back up. And this campaign is all about, to me, is about fighting for everyone in Pennsylvania that ever got knocked down, that needs to get back up, and fighting for all forgotten communities all across Pennsylvania that also got knocked down, that needs to get back up.
Okay, so again, I mean, you can see that towards the end of that, he was kind of mixing up his words, kind of struggling a little bit, but overall, I mean, I think that's a pretty good message, right? Especially in a state like Pennsylvania, where people have gotten decimated by, the outsourcing of manufacturing jobs and the opioid crisis and just so many other things, where people living in Pennsylvania, average working class Americans, have just been absolutely decimated by our systems and by capitalism, honestly. And so, giving this message out there that, like, yes, I went through this stroke, I'm going to confront it, right here and now, get this out in the open, confront the elephant in the room. But even though I had this stroke, I'm still bouncing back. I'm still trying to get back up on my feet, just like so many other millions of people around this country have had to do over the years. So I think that that's somewhat of a good attempt there to spin this in a positive direction and sort of tied in to his overall campaign messaging. So that was him just addressing it up front. Now I want to move into some of the absolutely wild clips that we got here from both John Fetterman and Dr. Oz. So here we have Dr. Oz's short little clip here on abortion, where he says basically this should not be a women's choice or a woman's choice. This should be between a doctor, a woman, and political representatives. So let's go ahead and watch this.
I want women, doctors, local political leaders, letting the democracy that's always allowed our nation to thrive, to put the best ideas forward so states can decide for themselves.
Okay, so again, I mean, you can't really say that this is between a woman and a doctor and then just casually like throw in state representatives there or, overall state legislatures in that decision-making process, and then also say that this is like somewhat of an individual choice. It's not an individual choice. And keep in mind, there's nothing democratic about this, okay? This is the same argument that conservatives were making during the overturning of Roe v. Wade, is they were constantly hammering home on this idea that like, oh, this is a states' rights issue and this is going to be returning the issue of abortion democratically back to the American people, where they can elect representatives who will, support their positions on this issue and then pass legislation accordingly. But if you go and look at the legislation that a lot of these conservative reactionary states have been passing, it is not stuff that is supported by a broad majority of the American people, and not even a broad majority within their own states, right? I mean, you want to talk about things like 6-week abortion bans or the heartbeat bills, which is what they're calling them, even though that's wildly misleading and disingenuous. You look at some of these extreme right-wing abortion bans that they have been putting in place. Some of these bills have like 20% approval rating within their states overall. So these are not like, democratic decisions that are being made. And also in a lot of these conservative state legislatures, they've essentially gerrymandered these districts, usually disproportionately along explicitly racial lines, to try to disenfranchise minority voters. And there's nothing democratic about this process. I mean, I've covered on this channel before, you could take specific case study examples in like a place like Wisconsin, for example, where their right-wing, Republican state legislature has effectively gerrymandered the system, along with obviously like voter suppression and policies that they deploy on that front. But they've effectively like gerrymandered these districts to the point where Democrats could win like 65% of the overall popular vote, and Republicans could still end up with damn near a supermajority control over the state legislature. So again, there's nothing democratic about this. The reason why they made that states' rights argument is so that they could use these gerrymandered districts, so that they could use these gerrymandered state legislatures that do not represent the popular will of the people in their state in order to force their reactionary agenda on the people living in those states. So, I mean, there's nothing democratic about it if you are involving state legislatures or people who are like political representatives in this decision making, which should just be up to the woman and the doctor. And I mean, again, just generally on this issue of abortion, these abortion bans are not going to do anything. They have not been doing anything other than making it that much more dangerous for people who not only want to get elective abortions, but even people who are going through, miscarriages or ectopic pregnancies or other just random complications with their pregnancies. This has put them in the position where like their lives are directly in jeopardy, because if you have this hanging legal threat over these doctors' backs and over these hospitals, they are not going to give women abortions, even when it is in the case to save the life of the mother, which is these, part of these exceptions that they often tout as if like that's an excuse to support these abortion bans. But the reality of the matter is that if you are threatening doctors, if you are threatening these hospitals with legal repercussion, or in some states even criminal repercussion for giving abortions, depending on like what decisions you may make in incredibly gray area situations, then they're not going to allow these women, even in the case of saving the life of the mother, to actually follow through and get those abortions unless they're like literally bleeding out on the operating table. Okay, so I mean, the exceptions are complete bullshit, obviously, and this idea that like this is a democratic choice, that this is something that is fulfilling the broader popular will of the American people or the people of Pennsylvania, it's just completely disingenuous. Obviously, political representatives should not have anything to do with these decisions. They should be up to the woman. They should be up to consultation between her and her doctor, period, end of story. And there you get to see a little bit of a glimpse in terms of how Dr. Oz feels about this hot topic right now of abortion rights. Now, we're going to switch back and forth here between Dr. Oz and John Fetterman. This one was a question that John Fetterman had on inflation and how he was going to approach this, and why, somebody like Dr. Oz, this millionaire snake oil salesman, out-of-state kind of guy, is not really equipped to actually address inflation in a meaningful capacity that will legitimately help average working class people within the state of Pennsylvania. So let's go ahead and jump into this clip here.
No, here's what I think we have to fight about inflation here right now. That's what we need to fight about inflation. Right now, because it's a tax on working families, and Dr. Oz can't possibly understand what that is like. He has 10 gigantic mansions. We must push back against corporate greed. We must make sure that we're also pushing back against price gouging as well, too. We also be able to make more in Pennsylvania, make more in America. When he had a choice to make his merchandise, the Oz label is on, he made it all in China. Who can you believe that can fight against inflation and pushing back against corporate greed, or somebody that is choosing working in China versus over American workers?
Okay, so I mean, again, obviously you see him struggling to sort of like piece together sentences, but that honestly wasn't that bad. I mean, he was struggling a little bit there, but he definitely got his message across, at least in my opinion. Now, maybe I'm a little bit biased in this because I think that his message was spot on there, but his overall message was 100% accurate, right? When you talk about what Republicans are planning to do in terms of addressing inflation versus what somebody like John Fetterman would be wanting to do to actually address inflation, it's just completely night and day. I mean, at the end of the day, people like Dr. Oz or the Republican Party more generally, if you go and read into their plans to address inflation, what is it? I mean, all that they have on the table is basically just trickle-down economics, right? It's Reaganomics. It's the exact same shit that Liz Truss was just doing over in the UK that completely obliterated their economy in like 40 days or however long she ended up being the prime minister over there. But it's like Trussonomics on steroids over here, right? So all they want to do is, reaffirm the 2017 Trump tax cuts, give fatter tax cuts to corporations and billionaires in this country, while simultaneously gutting social programs and spending like programs like Medicare, Social Security, Medicaid, etc. That is their openly stated agenda. How the fuck is that going to address inflation in any meaningful capacity whatsoever? How is that going to lower gas prices or food prices or any prices where we have been seeing this inflationary pressure across the board? It's just not, because the Republican idea about what has been causing inflation is just completely wrong, right? They think inflation was caused by Joe Biden and the Democratic Party's radical overspending, their socialist agenda, and all of these big bills that they have been passing, when that's just not the case, right? I covered on this channel just a couple days ago the Katie Porter whiteboard takedown, where she was explaining where the inflationary pressure is actually coming from, and it's coming from like two main factors, right? Supply chain breakdowns due to the pandemic and due to the fact that during this neoliberal era over about the last 40 years since the Reagan administration, we have decided to export our manufacturing base overseas to exploit cheap labor in places like China, Southeast Asia, Mexico as well, etc. We have exported these jobs overseas, and so when COVID hit, our supply chain was incredibly fragile and it fell apart. So that was one factor, but the main factor in this is exactly what John Fetterman was just pointing out there, tackling corporate greed, right? It's good that he's hammering home that message because, as Katie Porter was pointing out the other day, in that video that we watched, corporate greed, right? Them price gouging people, upcharging for their products. That has been over a majority of inflationary pressure across the board, right? This is how we end up with high gas prices right now, when if you actually look at the global oil markets, the last time that the global oil markets were at the point that they are right now at this price point, gas was like $2 cheaper per gallon, right? So it's like these numbers are not adding up. You have, oil prices that are sky high right now, while you simultaneously have these oil companies that are making record profits right now, tens of billions of dollars in profits. And it's not just the oil companies, it's the food industry as well. It's, big pharma as well. It's across the board. This is what has been driving inflation disproportionately. It has just been excess profits from corporate America, okay? They are price gouging the American people. So if you wanted to actually address inflation in a meaningful capacity, you would do exactly what the fuck John Fetterman was just laying out there, right? You would increase domestic manufacturing, bring back jobs, in his case to Pennsylvania, but just broadly here in the United States. And number two, you would address corporate greed. You would pass things like a windfall profits tax, right? You would, push forward with, for example, like Medicare negotiating prescription drug prices, or you would tackle this in a, maybe you could do anti-monopoly stuff and trust bust a lot of these industries, right? Those are the types of things that you would actually do to meaningfully address inflation. You would have to tackle corporate greed first and foremost. That needs to be the first step that you take in actually going about addressing that issue. And John Fetterman is the only candidate on that stage that actually even recognizes that as the core issue at stake here. So I think that was a pretty good clip, even though again he was somewhat stumbling and somewhat struggling through his message there. But now I want to move on to this exchange, which was about the fact that we have seen Dr. Roz basically hammering home that John Fetterman is the reincarnation or the 2.0 version of Bernie Sanders, and John Fetterman basically pushes back against that narrative. So let's go ahead and jump into this one.
Again, it's the Oz rule. He's on TV and he's lying. I never supported any of that thing. He keeps talking about Bernie Sanders. 3 years ago he was on his show and he hugged him and he said, "I love this guy. You know what? Why don't you pretend that you live in Vermont instead of Pennsylvania and run against Bernie Sanders? Because all you can do is talk about Bernie Sanders. Because my truth is that healthcare is a basic fundamental right. And I believe in expanding that, and I believe about fighting for healthcare, the kind of healthcare that saved my life."
Okay, so again, I think that was a pretty good hit there from John Fetterman. Now, I wouldn't be leaning away from Bernie Sanders. That would be my advice, because if you go look at the polling data on this, Bernie Sanders obviously consistently for almost like a decade straight running now has been the single most popular senator in the entire country, and there's a reason for that. It's because he's fighting for basic fundamental rights like healthcare, which John Fetterman also supports. Policies like Medicare for all and treating it as a human right instead of as a commodity. Now, Dr. Roz consistently hitting him on being tied to Bernie Sanders and supporting his radical healthcare plan, which, by the way, Medicare for all has an overwhelming majority support among the American people. That's not going to land, right? If anything, that's going to help somebody like John Fetterman, in my opinion, at least. You go back to like 2016 or 2020, and you look at the polling data in terms of how many Pennsylvania voters supported somebody like Bernie Sanders, he had way higher approval ratings than either Joe Biden or Hillary Clinton or Donald Trump within the state of Pennsylvania. So, I mean, I guess go for it, Dr. Oz. Keep comparing him to Bernie Sanders, one of the most popular politicians in the entire country. But again, I think he made a good point there in terms of, like, you know, again, feeding into that same narrative that has actually been pretty successful in painting Dr. Oz as like this out-of-state carpetbagger, saying, you know, why don't you go challenge Bernie Sanders in Vermont and go pretend that you live in that state instead of pretending that you live in the state of Pennsylvania. So I think that he did kind of hit him there a little bit. Now I want to get into this Dr. Oz clip here, just kind of speeding through these so that this video isn't too long. But this is his take on the $15 minimum wage. And, you know, this is something I've talked about before, but Dr. Oz's position on especially some of these economic issues is just absolutely fucking insane. So let's go ahead and watch this one.
Do you support raising the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour? Why or why not? You have 60 seconds.
I think market forces have already driven up the minimum wage. I was with a hotel worker actually here in Harrisburg a few months ago, and he was telling me how hard it was to live on the $15 an hour that he was getting paid. John Fetterman shoots too low. We want much more money than that. And there are many ways to achieve that, but John Fetterman thinks the minimum wage is his weekly allowance from his parents.
Okay, so I don't really know what the fuck that allowance remark was at the end of that clip, but Dr. Oz, in previous interviews, has said that he doesn't even support conceptually, like, the idea of a minimum wage, right? He not only doesn't even want to raise the federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, but he doesn't even really, you know, even necessarily support the $7.25 an hour, which is just completely fucking insane. And the idea that, like, market forces or capitalism is going to drive wages up, where the fuck is the proof for that? Because we have the data on this, right? I mean, obviously the federal minimum wage has been completely stagnant for what, like 14 years straight now? I mean, it hasn't been risen throughout the entirety of the Obama administration, Trump administration, the Biden administration. They failed to get the $15. So, like, you know, the federal minimum wage is the only thing that has propped up wages across the board and prevented corporations in this country from trying to, you know, throw like $2 an hour at average American workers, right? And if you look at the data on this in terms of a long-term perspective, since like roughly the Reagan administration, wages in this country have been completely stagnant relative to indicators like inflation and productivity numbers. It's been completely fucking stagnant since like the 1980s. So what are you talking about? Market forces are going to magically drive up, you know, drive up the minimum wage that is paid across the board in this country? It's just not going to fucking happen. You have to have the federal government step in and lay a floor there, or else people are just going to be paid starvation wages, which is exactly what is already happening right now. So, like, you know, what are you talking about? And even on the specific example that he gave there, you know, a hotel worker who was saying they're barely scraping by on $15 an hour. I mean, yeah, that's true, right? Because $15 an hour, even right now, isn't even really enough to be a fully living wage in this country right now. So, I mean, again, if you go back to those numbers, and if wages had just kept pace since like the post-World War II era, during the height of economic prosperity here in the United States, if it had just kept pace with productivity and inflation, the minimum wage right now would be roughly like $25 an hour. So, yeah, I mean, I agree, we should go above and beyond $15 an hour, but you need to do that from the federal level. You can't just magically expect that, like, you're going to cut taxes for the billionaire class, do trickle down economics, and somehow that's going to lead to skyrocketing wages way above $15 an hour. Like, this man is just out in his own fucking world, completely delusional, doesn't even understand the market forces that he's talking about here, right? You want to talk about just at a fundamental level what capitalism does in terms of market forces to wages. Their only goal is to crush labor as much as possible. Their goal is to extract as much surplus value, or profits as we call them under capitalism, to extract as much surplus value off of the backs of their workers by driving down wages and down benefits and down working conditions as much as they can legally get away with. So, like, the idea that capitalists have an incentive to just raise wages for the betterment of their workers, it's just not fucking true even in theory, and it's also obviously not true in practice either. So now I want to get to this other clip here, which was probably one of the worst clips that I've seen from John Fetterman during this debate. This one was specifically on fracking, which is obviously a position of his, which I vehemently disagree with. So let's go ahead and watch this one.
Create energy independence.
I must correct the record.
Just a second, Mr. Oz. I do want to clarify something. You're saying tonight that you support fracking, that you've always supported fracking, but there is that 2018 interview that you said, quote, "I don't support fracking at all." So how do you square the two?
I do support fracking, and I support fracking, and I do support fracking.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Fetterman.
Okay, so I mean, yeah, I mean, both on the in terms of him getting his words out there, obviously, again, struggling pretty clearly in that clip. But I mean, again, his position on fracking is just atrocious in my opinion. It's disastrous for the environment. You want to meaningfully address climate change. Fracking is not a good long-term solution. Now, again, he's in the state of Pennsylvania. There's a lot of fracking jobs, and this is basically just a political move by him. So whatever, take with that what you will. It's not the biggest deal to me, but at the same time, not really a great position there. And definitely not a great response to that question. Now I want to move on to this one. So this was basically towards the end of the debate where they were giving their closing statements, and John Fetterman decided to butt in to remind Dr. Oz and the people watching this debate that he actually wants to cut Social Security, as he is about to pretend like he is someone who supports protecting Social Security. So let's go ahead and watch this one.
I've talked to seniors worried their Social Security checks wouldn't go far enough with the raging inflation. I've talked to couples when I make their first down payment on a new house and they can't afford it anymore because of interest rates. I've talked to families.
You want to cut
petrified.
Social Security.
Mr. Fetterman, it's his turn for his closing.
I've talked.
Okay, so, I mean, yeah, obviously he wasn't really supposed to come out and say that during Dr. Oz's closing statements, but he's 100% right, and Dr. Oz shouldn't be allowed to get away with that narrative, right? Talking about how seniors, oh, they're coming to me and they're so worried that their Social Security payments aren't enough to keep up with inflation. Well, you literally want to cut Social Security, okay? You don't want to increase Social Security payments for seniors. What the fuck are you talking about coming out here pretending like you are in support of raising Social Security payments or protecting it, right? This is the narrative. This is the big lie that conservatives have put forward about programs like Medicare, like Medicaid, like Social Security. This idea that like, oh my God, they're going to become solvent. We're not going to have enough money to continue paying them. It's complete fucking bullshit, okay? The only reason why there's even this idea of being able or not being able to pay Social Security payments into the future is because of the way that conservatives have put caps on how we raise funds for programs like Social Security. For example, right now, we don't even have a system where somebody who's making $10 million a year pays significantly more or proportionately more into Social Security than somebody who's making like $100,000 a year. The system that we have right now in terms of the payment structure to funnel money into Social Security programs, it's completely fucked up, and it's because conservatives don't want their rich buddies and themselves, people like Dr. Oz, who are worth millions of dollars, if not hundreds of millions of dollars, they don't want to have to pay disproportionately more into those programs. And just a reminder here, guys, if you're familiar with modern monetary theory, there is absolutely no reason why we could not just fully fund these programs, okay? It is a complete fucking lie, this idea that like the national debt or the deficit is just this inherently horrible thing that is disastrous and that it's like a credit card payment or it's like a household debt type of situation. It's just not fucking true. We're talking about the federal government. The United States is the global reserve currency, and we have a sovereign currency here in the United States. We have no limitation on the money supply other than basically inflationary pressure. But again, the inflation we've been seeing recently is not because of an overheated economy. It's not because of too much money in circulation. It's because of capitalists. It's because of corporations price gouging the American people. So even just the underlying premise that conservatives use as a justification to cut Social Security and pretend like, oh, we're actually saving the program long term by cutting the funding towards it, it's complete horseshit. So, I mean, credit to John Fetterman there for calling out his bullshit while he's trying to sell that lie to the people watching this debate. Now, those are the clips that I just wanted to show you guys. Apparently, according to the people who watched this debate, it was overwhelmingly seen as a win for Dr. Oz over John Fetterman. I mean, you can see here in the numbers from this WPXI post-debate poll, they say only 18% of people thought that John Fetterman won this debate compared to 82% for Dr. Oz. Now, this has already been a pretty close race already, so obviously I think that this was a political disaster for John Fetterman, and honestly, it probably would have been better for him to just not do this debate at all. He had his moments in there, he had some good, call-outs, but just generally, he was very clearly struggling, and I think this is only going to have, or cause people to ask more questions about his health, about the stroke, about all of that type of situation than before this debate even took place. So honestly, I don't even know why they let him do this debate. I would have probably thought that it would have been politically advantageous to just keep dealing with, the attacks about, oh, you don't want to debate Dr. Oz. Obviously I think in principle, everybody should have to debate across the board, but just if I was one of his political advisors, I probably would not have allowed this debate to go through. Now, again, there's other questions here in terms of like, How much do debates actually affect these types of elections? How many people were actually watching this debate? How many people were actually paying attention to this? I don't really know. Obviously, I think the media is going to absolutely blast John Fetterman and, go after him for his struggles during this debate, which, I think to some extent is granted. Obviously, I question, the mental health of people like Herschel Walker, right? I've questioned the mental health of people like Joe Biden, who have very clearly struggled. But I think the situation is a little bit different with John Fetterman because, he recently had a stroke, and according to what we've heard from his doctor so far, it's not a cognitive issue, right? It's not something that would affect his actual ability to do the job of a senator. It's more of just a speech thing, and it's more of just an auditory processing thing, which is something that you can work around, right? And I think obviously over time he's going to get significantly better and improve. So I don't think it's like the biggest deal in the world, but whether or not the voters in Pennsylvania are going to see it as a big deal, that's an entirely different issue. But I think he did have somewhat success getting across his main message there in this debate, and we're going to have to see how this actually ends up affecting the race overall. So just as another point here, apparently after the debate, John Fetterman, his campaign is saying that it raised $1 million in just 3 hours after the rough Pennsylvania Senate debate with Dr. Oz. So I don't know. I have no ability to accurately predict how people in Pennsylvania are going to actually view this debate, or whether or not it's going to affect them, or whether or not they're going to be able to just look at the policies that each of these people stand for. Because, again, at the end of the day, whether or not he has struggles because of his stroke or whatever the fuck, that's really just not the key issue here. You can have questions about that. You can ask for clarification about that, whatever. But at the end of the day, we're talking about comparing somebody who supports universal health care, supports transitioning aggressively towards renewable energy, even though he supports fracking, right? Somebody who supports significantly lifting wages, somebody who supports the PRO-Acts protecting union rights, somebody who actually stands for an agenda and is willing to fight for working class Americans, versus somebody who is literally just a fucking corrupt millionaire out-of-state carpetbagger like Dr. Oz, who has spent his career being a snake oil salesman and hawking these fucking fake fraudulent products to people, making millions of dollars off of them, and then just decided he wanted to throw his hat in the ring and come into this seat and try to basically just like buy it off. To do what? To just serve his rich buddies, to cut taxes for the wealthy, to gut social programs that help millions and millions of people across the state of Pennsylvania and across the country. In terms of like what they actually stand for, doing a substantive analysis of both of these candidates, it should not even be fucking close. But I'll keep you guys updated. Obviously, we have the midterm elections that are coming up just in about a couple weeks now, so hopefully John Fetterman can hold on there, and this debate performance is not going to affect him negatively in too drastic of a way.
Everyone is saying good politic guy has the best politics. Believe me, no one does it like him. Believe me, everyone is saying